Bonjour tout le monde. J'espère que vous allez bien. I'm Guy Laforêt. I'm the new president of the Federation, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here today this afternoon for Congress 2017's second last Big Thinking lecture. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. Le Dish with One Spoon est un traité entre les Anishinaabe, Mississaugas et Haudenosaunee qui les relie ensemble pour partager le territoire et pour protéger les terres. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We at the Federation are also grateful for the hard work and preparations undertaken by our host, Ryerson University, and we'd like to thank them, Marco Fiola, Patricia Albanese, and all their colleagues for their fantastic work. J'aimerais signaler avant de commencer que nous proposons un service d'interprétation simultanée au moyen de votre téléphone cellulaire. Les détails se trouvent à l'entrée de l'auditorium et sur les chevalets près de l'estrade. Je souhaite remercier nos partenaires, SHIRT, the Canadian Foundation for Innovation, and Universities Canada, that have made this series that we call Voir Grand, Big Thinking possible. It is thanks to the generosity of such sponsors that we're able to make these events possible. Again, I'd like to extend a special thanks to the sponsors of today's events, Ryerson University. As we consider, let me make sure that I'm at the right place. Thank you again for being here today. No, it's okay. I will be more coherent in a second. As we consider Canada's past and future, as a Federalist scholar, I should know about the past. Prompted by our Congress team of the next 150 on Indigenous lands, the Big Thinking series gives us an opportunity to explore issues that transform, inspire, and challenge us. Et aujourd'hui ne fait pas exception à cette règle. On est très heureux d'accueillir ici aujourd'hui le journaliste réputé Mohamed Fahmy. I'd now like to invite Arun Siddiqui, Ryerson Distinguished Visiting Professor and former Toronto Star columnist and editor, to introduce Mohamed.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Marco. Thank you all for coming. Before I introduce Mohamed, I do want to acknowledge the presence here of Margaret Abraham. She is the president of the International Sociological Federation, which is holding its International Congress in Toronto next year. Please stand up. Most of us are familiar with the illustrious career of Mohamed Fahmy, and especially his ordeal in Egypt, which he has encapsulated in his book, which is outside for sale, entitled The Marriott Cell. The title drawn from the hotel where the raid took place and where they arrested him. What is less known about Mohamed and his career is that he comes to his bold journalism partly because of his DNA. His father, Fadel Fahmy, was also a fearless critic of a former Egyptian dictator, Hosni Mubarak, and for having done so was detained and put on a watch list in Cairo. The family moved to Canada in 1991 when Fahmy was but a child. What is also less well known is that Mohamed reported on the Iraq War from day one in 2003 for the Los Angeles Times. That he covered the initial dawn of the Arab Spring in 2011, and with his colleagues at CNN, won the prestigious Peabody Award for Distinguished and Meritorious Journalism, which is a rare honor in the United States. Then he joined Al Jazeera English, following the footsteps of another illustrious Canadian, Tony Berman, former head of the CBC and then head of Al Jazeera English. In 2013, as we all know, there was a military coup in Egypt, and the first ever elected leader of Egypt in Egypt's history was toppled. And a few months later, General Sisi's forces arrested Mohammed on totally trumped-up charges and did not release him until January 2015. That followed a worldwide protest by journalists and human rights activists, including the British lawyer Amal Clooney. For me, his 438-day incarceration came disturbingly close to the 444-day American hostage crisis in Iran in 1979 and 81, which I had covered in great detail. But Fahmy's fate was far worse than that of the American diplomat, because he was thrown into a notorious prison and put also under solitary confinement. It is useful to recall, I think, that during Fahmy's incarceration, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper was mostly silent, which was not a surprise because Harper was a fan of General Sisi, because he said he brought stability to Egypt. Harper's love affairs with dictator is the same as that of Donald Trump. Donald Trump also likes Sisi, as he likes, of course, Vladimir Putin, Turkish Prime Minister and now President Tayyip Erdogan, and lately Saudi Arabia's King Salman, all despots who harass and detain and jail journalists. Fahmy, if you recall, was charged in Egypt with, quote unquote, spreading false news. Curiously, this is the same charge that Donald Trump lays at the mainstream American media today for telling the truth about him. All of which is to say that on the issue of free speech, the distinction that used to exist between democracies and dictatorship is fast disappearing. This is an extraordinarily disturbing development. Even Canada has slipped in the World Freedom Index from among the top 10 now to a lowly 22. In Quebec, if you remember, La Presse columnist Patrick Lagacé was spied upon by Montreal police. His iPhone was tapped, and his movements were tracked. In Hamilton, not too far from here, this month, 2 journalists were manhandled by police. Vice reporter Ben Makuch has been ordered to hand over all of his digital communication with a Daesh supporter in Calgary. An employee of the CJFE was manhandled by right-wing thugs not too far from here this month at the Nathan Phillips Square. So in these times, we need the voice of our guest speaker more than ever, not just to comment on the affairs of Egypt and the troubled Middle East, but also very much here in Canada. So please welcome a very brave and heroic Canadian, Mohamed Fahmy.
Thank you for having me here today and this honorable presentation by pioneers in the field. Thank you. I'd like to start by saying that it's such a more relaxed person than I was when I first got out. It's been over a year since my release, and I remember arriving to Ryerson and holding a press conference when I first got here to highlight a lot of what happened in terms of Mr. Harper's support and whatnot. And it has been a healing process, and that would have not happened without the support of so many Canadians and academics and organizations here in Canada. I'd like to take you on a voyage. I studied here in Canada and moved here and immigrated to Canada like millions of people, seeking these very important values of press freedom and human rights and the basic values that we live with today. And I traveled back to the Middle East to cover the Iraq War on the first day as an assistant reporter, stringer with the Los Angeles Times, with that honest and genuine belief that we're going in there to implement democracy and see the flourish of a new era without Saddam Hussein. And as soon as I arrived there, I realized that it's not that easy. And of course, the Iraqi people, many of them were welcoming, and people didn't have cell phones or the ability to speak or protest, and it was such a great experience, euphoric in many ways. But then we realized after a while that it has become almost a symbolic democracy, where people were just so happy to have their and show off the ink on their when they vote, and that's what started happening in the Arab Spring as well. There, you come in with all these ideas of implementing democracy, but you don't have the structure to make it happen. And that was something that I observed in the beginning when I got in there as a young 27-year-old journalist. Then going forward and moving with these ideals and hoping that the press mark on my chest is going to protect me as a neutral part of the journalistic teams there. But after a while, it became obvious that it's actually become a target, and I preferred to remove it at some point because, at one point or another, journalists have become more than ever targeted both by extremists, Islamic extremists, and other terrorists and governments, and there's almost no neutral zone for us to work, to be able to file our stories and work freely. There has been cases in Iraq where journalists were killed and targeted, but then covering the Arab Spring, that was euphoric. So many Canadian Egyptians and American Egyptians and Arabs and foreigners came in, poets, writers, academics, with that hope that real change would happen. And I went covering the Arab Spring from Egypt to Libya to Iraq. And it was all that sentiment of people hungry for change and seeing a real opportunity to live and get rid of the dictators running these countries. People ask me, was the Arab Spring in vain? At emotional times, I would say, yes, it was in vain. These people died for nothing, and nothing has changed. We still have dictators there, and these terrorist groups are now running freely and more than ever. And then at times, when I'm more relaxed and I'm thinking more clearly and I'm seeing the big picture, I don't think it was in vain. I think it has opened the horizon for so many people to be able to understand that you can protest, you can use social media, you can congregate, you can think together. This power of the people, a cliche that is used immensely, but it is true that it could happen. You could topple dictators, you could achieve change. So it is not in vain. It may be hard to explain that to the thousands of families who've lost their youth in these protests, who have been killed, but in reality, it has not been in vain. There's so much rhetoric and so much change happening in the Middle East, and that has affected the whole world. So going in with these values, thinking that if I stick to my values of accurate journalism and objective journalism, I will be fine. I wasn't spared. I wasn't killed, but I was branded as a terrorist myself. In Egypt at the time, the Muslim Brotherhood, a group that brands themselves as moderates, they won the elections in Egypt, and I was working for Al Jazeera English as the bureau chief. And it's very important here to clarify that the English channel, I was very clear in my differentiation between the English and the Arabic channel. The Arabic channel accurately were pro-Muslim Brotherhood, and they had been supporting a lot of the Islamic drift that's happening in the Middle East at the moment, whether in Syria and Libya and so on. But like Mr. Sadiqi said, Mr. Tony Berman was working in Al Jazeera English. I believed it was a good channel. Unfortunately, the Egyptian government did not. They branded Al Jazeera as one big entity, as a Qatari-owned TV network. And we got to look at the geopolitics of the situation here. Qatar and Turkey are extreme supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, financially, politically, while the other camp, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, are against the Muslim Brotherhood, and they have designated them as terrorists. Now, there is no universal definition of the word terrorist, and that is something I still struggle with. So overnight, the last story I reported was the designation of the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. I was on air, analyzing it, talking about it. 4 days later, we got the knock on the door, the Marriott Hotel, and the police storm in, and they arrest me and my colleagues, and we are branded as terrorists and members of the Muslim Brotherhood before we even got to the station. It's all over the news. And then we end up in the Scorpion prison. The Scorpion prison is basically one of the most, harsh or strict prisons in the Middle East. It houses members of the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS fighters who came in from Syria and Libya to try to topple the Egyptian regime. And to find yourself overnight, you become the story and you're living with these people. In the beginning, for me, it was the best thing that ever happened, because I thought I was going to leave the next morning. I was like, great, I'm going to get a good story and I'm going to go home, But as the hours, as it became very obvious that this is a very serious situation, and I'm going to be here for the long haul. So in prison, you look at these people, and you listen to them, you're living with them. Throughout my career, so many people and journalists have been killed, and I have been through hairy situations because I want to understand these people. And when you listen to them, you start thinking about yourself, because you've seen it from the front seat. You've seen what happened in Iraq, and you cannot just blame what's happening with the terrorism dominating our headlines on just these terrorists, because as a young reporter in Iraq, I may not have understood the magnitude of what was happening, but for example, I visited Camp Buka prison in southern Basra. I didn't go inside the prison, but I was outside trying to figure out what's happening inside. And what was happening inside in 2003 was that this prison contained 9 of the current ISIS leaders today. They met in that prison under the eyes of the American guards, and they were able to recruit, they were able to spread their ideology, and that's where ISI started, in Iraq under the eyes of the American public. Now, I'm not saying that what Donald Trump is saying is true, because I don't accept most of what he says on many topics, when he says that, oh, Hillary Clinton and Obama created ISIS, No, it doesn't happen this way. It's just inexperience, and that has led to countries like Iraq and Libya turning into hubs for terrorists, and has left the Iraqi population, many people in the Iraqi population, saying, hey, we were better off during Saddam, or better off during Gaddafi, because it is unbearable. Yesterday, another ISIS bomb blew up an ice cream shop, 11 people were killed, horrific stories. And by the time I've left Libya or Iraq, there wasn't one functioning police station. So it is quite a tragedy. But you look at these people I lived with in prison, they live with the motto that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Now, we can debate this all day long, but it's, a terrorist is a terrorist. If you are, killing civilians because they're not signing on to your religion, or you are defying the forces of the military and the police because you think that what you have to say is true and everybody should sign on, you are a terrorist. That's where it ends here. But the biggest problem now in the Middle East is that we're seeing all these different coalitions like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and others consider these people as terrorists while the other guys are not. And they're funding these groups in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, and even ISIS in the case of Qatar, for example. So the fight for freedom taught me a lot of things. Taught me that you can't put your eggs in the basket of the government. Yes, you need to work with the government. And in my small foundation, we get many families of Canadians who call me and say, should we trust the government? I say, yes, trust the government, but you need to have your teams on the ground cooperating with NGOs who in that country where your loved one is detained, journalists who know what they're doing, and activists who do not abide by the red tape that shackles the ambassadors of Canada when they're working abroad. Yes, they were visiting me. Yes, they were doing a good job, but they still felt shackled. And from my experience, I mean, at the moment, we have more than 1,200 Canadians detained abroad. But we also have a major issue, and I've been working on it with Amnesty International and other people who are very concerned. Canada does not have a law that obligates the government to intervene when a Canadian is detained abroad, while the US, Germany, Brazil, France, many of our allies and many of the countries of the EU have it as legislation. So that is something I've met Mr. Stéphane Dion, our former Foreign Affairs Minister, and Mr. Trudeau, and we've discussed it, and Mr. Guy Pardee, the former Director of Consular Affairs, has also been speaking about it, and we are trying to get the attention of a Member of Parliament to take it on as a private member's bill, because I do believe that we should have a law so that the Prime Minister would wake up in the morning, put his political ideas aside, forget about his friends in the Middle East and the arms deals, and go and extract this Canadian for whatever reason. If it's for smoking marijuana, for being accused of political issues like journalism, for being accused of and prosecuted for being gay in some countries in the Middle East, which is not acceptable in any way. So we need this law, and this is something I'm working on. So you come back here in Canada, and my wife was so shocked when the police was so nice to us in the streets, and she saw how this system works here. And then gradually she started understanding that, why Canada is being modeled as this pioneer of democracy, why the British mayor of London is modeling his refugee system based on what Mr. Trudeau has done here, and why people consider Canada a pioneer in press freedom. So I enjoyed the honeymoon status here, and then I started speaking to Canadian journalists who were telling me a whole new reality. And Mr. Siddiqui had mentioned some of them. I met Mr. Patrick Lagasse, Ben McCoo, Justin Brake. I communicated with him. These are journalists that are really suffering back home here in Canada, specifically because they're being forced to turn their sources in. Now, this is a huge issue, because if we start giving our sources to the authorities, nobody will speak to the journalists. It's a complete breach of press freedom and what it means to have that right for freedom of expression. So, yes, indeed, I wrote an op-ed days before the release of the World Press Freedom Index, and I said, I doubt that Canada's ranking is going to improve. I mean, it dropped 10 points during Mr. Harper's tenure, and it's by Reporters Without Borders, and they said during Mr. Harper's dark ages, the journalism status in Canada was horrific. So it dropped 4 more points to 22. For the first time in history, Canada is not in the top 20. And the reasons are just these cases, of course. Ben McCoo being forced to give in his background notes after interviewing an alleged Calgary man who joined ISIS. Patrick Lagasse and 10 other reporters their phones were spied on, and Justin Brake, who was covering a protest. But there is victories, and I was extremely happy when I heard that Mr. Claude Carignan, if I'm saying that right, the head of the Senate of the opposition, he proposed Bill S-231, which is basically calling for the protection of the journalistic sources. And it has passed a vote, and it's going for the third reading, probably in April or May, at the House of Commons, and at the federal level. So we could be having a law in Canada, and just to point again, and this is a mystery as I research it, that like the same thing, we don't have a law that obligates the government to intervene when we are detained abroad. We also, most of our allies have a law that protects the sources of journalists, but we don't. So this is a mystery that I am trying to figure out here as we research this dilemma. You know, a lot of these issues are starting to ring a bell with what I went through in the Middle East. In the courtroom, the judge was showing and playing audio recording of an interview I did with the brother of the head of al-Qaeda, Mohamed al-Zawahiri, and he was using this as evidence against me. And I told him, this is what we do as journalists. I speak to terrorists, rapists, killers, and thank you for showing off my work, you know. And then, you know, on Press Freedom Day, I told him, sir, the world is watching, you know, let us go on bail, we're tired, we're sleeping on the floor. You know, and while writing my book, it was kind of torturous to revisit the whole process again. And, you know, to spend so much time in prison, sleeping on the floor in a cell with no light and lots of cockroaches, and you're on the floor, and you're allowed sometimes out for an hour a day, sometimes you're inside for weeks in solitary confinement. I still do remember the cell. I used to do 3 steps a day, strides in my cell, and that would be my exercise for the day for about a month. So, you know, at this point, you might ask yourself, how do you survive a situation like this? How do I keep myself and maintain my sanity? Well, prison is designed to break you. It's designed for everyone to wear the same uniform. It's designed to take away your independence, your humanity. And I've seen people lose their minds. I've seen people die. But luckily, we had so much support outside. And somehow through the cracks of the prison, there was news that people were rallying outside, that 100,000 people have signed a petition, that there are rallies everywhere. They're talking about you. And this is what made a difference. It wasn't about me anymore or my 2 other colleagues. It was about, you know, that very important core of democracy, press freedom, to be able to say what you want. And if the other side thinks you're wrong, to be able to at least have a fair trial or due process. And that was the whole fight in there. And it kept me going, and it kept my colleagues going. And if you think these petitions don't make a difference, it's wrong. Advocacy is the reason why I'm here today. My lawyer, Amal Clooney, submitted in her court defense in writing saying that 100,000 people signed the petition. This man is not a terrorist. It was published in Arabic newspapers that so many Canadians signed this petition. And it is that aspect of maintaining in that cell your spiritual side, your physical side, and your mental side to be able to survive. Luckily, after a while, we were allowed some books, and that made the biggest difference in my life. And you know, I read more than 100 books. Some of them, the Canadian ambassador brought them in with the Toronto Star and the New York Times and a little bit of maple syrup, you know. Life became a little better. No pancakes, there was a lot of this. But inside, it's that you discover yourself again, and you see you know, there's no more internet. There's no more, you know, distractions. You're playing that tape all over again, your life, and you're evaluating. It has always been about being on the front line before anyone else and getting that byline and writing the story, you know, and, you know, so now you realize that, oh, okay, family, friends, who are the ones asking about me? Who's doing what? Who's writing what? And, you know, books, the thinnest book, and it's very ironic, that really helped me a lot was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It was the thinnest book. And, you know, Viktor Frankl is a neurologist. He survived the Auschwitz in Germany. His whole family, most of his family was killed, and including his pregnant wife. And you read what he says and how he describes the fear of being the next person in line. You feel, he talks about this tragic optimism, this theory of how do you turn this suffering and death and injustice into something that is, you know, useful, an achievement for humankind, and be able to rise above this injustice. And I think this book did it for me. And I read it a couple of times in prison. I read it again outside prison. And it is powerful because he does explain you know, how hard it was for those people killed during the Holocaust. And you realize, you know what, maybe I am lucky, you know. And I am luckier than many other journalists, friends of mine. I was during my incarceration, Charlie Hebdo happened, but even worse, a friend of mine, Stephen Sotloff, I was transferred to a hospital during my incarceration under security for an operation on my shoulder, and I switched the TV and I see a friend of mine in an orange jumpsuit being beheaded by ISIS. He was just in my house in Cairo visiting me months ago, telling me I'm going to Syria with passion that I remember very well. And my wife does too, when he was telling me, no, I want to report on Syria from Syria. And I really want to make a difference. And he was researching his trip very well. You know, he's no cowboy like other people may think. And that's the point. And then you see people celebrating his slaughter. People that I live with are celebrating his death. Terrorists. So you say, okay, maybe I am lucky, you know. But you speak to them and they'll tell you, yeah, well, the Americans and the coalition killed our people in Iraq. He's a spy, you know. So it's not even possible to have conversations with these people. And that is the main issue here. If we go back to people who think bombs are going to solve the situation, I totally disagree. Yes, bombs will help, but you know, to be able to tackle these terrorists, you got to go from the core, from the curriculum in some of these schools in the Middle East that allows the spread of this insightful rhetoric that, you know, portrays some aspects of the religion without completing the other aspects that condone violence. You know, it's a phenomenon. Because I've seen so many youth being radicalized in these prisons. You know, you see people saying, oh, radicalization. But when you see it happening in front of you, it is scary. I saw students who are coming in, young guys who were protesting against the government, and they were branded as terrorists. They had a lot of zealous, but in the prison, I could see after a while they were radicalized right in front of me. The beards are long, they're talking aggressively, they've been sitting around along with veteran extremists. And the prisons become universities. And they produce terrorists rather than become rehabilitation centers. And that is something all Western governments should deal with. Because, you know, as many governments in the Middle East are to be blamed for a lot of these terrorists that are flourishing, but also Western governments need to bear this responsibility as well for the mismanagement that happened on the ground in many of these countries, regardless of your intention of implementing democracy, which is a very fair and sound goal. And then we get Trump. You know, it's, I write in my book that with all these news, talk of fake news, it is very important, and I do it. I watch the Arabic press and the Arabic media, I watch the American press, I look at the French press to be able to read between the lines and find out the truth. During my coverage in the Middle East, almost every single dictator would come out periodically. I used to work for CNN for 3 years, and they would say, oh, CNN is no good, or the New York Times is targeting us, we don't accept this, everything they're saying is wrong. And then we would have to coordinate with the government to tell them, you know, we said this for a specific reason. But then when Trump started doing this, the Arabic anchors, many of the Arabic anchors, and many of these governments were saying, hey, you know, the President of the United States is saying exactly what we've been saying years ago. He's given legitimacy to these dictators, basically. And it is not acceptable. And you know, I call on journalists to be unified, the same way they were unified to champion press freedom, to be unified to counter such accusations, because it will allow even extremists to target journalists on the ground. You know, human rights have been marginalized now. You don't see the State Department being so concerned about the 120 journalists who are detained in Turkey. During my campaign, our campaign for our release, there was more than 5 billion impressions on Twitter calling for our release. So my colleagues and I, Peter Greste and Bahir Mohammed, joined Amnesty last week in a campaign for the Turkish journalists, Free Turkey Media, hashtag, and we held that hashtag on a poster to remind people that this could save the lives of these people inside. I thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to your questions, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Merci Mohamed pour ces paroles fortes et très convaincantes. It's now my pleasure to invite questions from the audience with the time remaining. There are mics. You can ask your questions in English or in French, and we'd like you to say your name when you start asking questions to Mohamed, please. Floor is yours. I'll do like any teacher does in a classroom. I'll count in my head to 10 twice, and after that, I'll ask the first question if nobody does. Aside Viktor Frankl, what was the best book you read in prison?
It was, you know, Nelson Mandela's Road to Freedom. You know, it's a huge book, but it's also very different when you're reading it in a cell. Yeah. It gives you ideas.
My name is Katrina Sark. I teach cultural studies at the University of Victoria, and I'm teaching a media class.
You could speak
thanks
a bit
for your
louder.
talk. Speak up?
Yeah, I can't hear you.
Sorry. My question is about something you just said about watching the Arab news, the American news, and the French media, and reading between the lines to look for the truth. Is this something we all should be doing, something that we should teach our students to do? Is this a new practice? How could you just expand on that a little bit?
Thank you. It's just the nature of media. I mean, you'll see our Canadian media, I don't think they give enough attention, this is my opinion, to international news. That's how I see it. But other than that, it's just the nature of the beast. The US will be concentrating more on what's happening with Trump and Comey and the FBI and all that, but there's many neglected, very important stories happening on the other side of the world that are not being covered on the Western press. So I believe, and I do it every day in the morning, I see what CNN is saying, what CBC is saying, what France 24 is saying, and then I tune into some of the Arabic channels. But also people ask me all the time, which channel should we trust? I tell them, you should focus on specific journalists that you should trust, ones that you feel are not public relations fluffers for the government, who you know, supporting an idea over another, people who are just doing their job for what we journalists do.
So who in Canada do you trust?
No, I trust many journalists in Canada. I trust Ben McCoo from Vice. I trust Diane Sawyer from CBC. I trust, you know, Mansbridge. You know, you just, and I follow them on Twitter, and I differentiate, and I know that I'm going to wake up in the morning and I'm going to get news from a reliable source. I never look at a specific channel that I favor over the other.
Thank you.
As teachers, we say some of the same things. Never rely exclusively on one sole source, even a trusted one. Would you expand on that? A journalist you really trust, but you need other sources.
Yeah. No, I mean, we do it as journalists all the time in terms of getting as many sources as possible. Sometimes there are sources that don't want to go on the record, and you're just trying to corroborate, to be able to write this paragraph with total confidence that what you're putting in there is solid and you're not taking away from the reality. But, you know, even as, you know, researchers and academics, I've done a little bit of lecturing and in the academia field, you know, and I try my best to just try to get a bigger picture all the time, rather than just focusing on, you know, one or two sources.
Thank you.
I'm Gauri Srinivasan with the Federation, and I'm thrilled that I get a chance to ask a question, because usually we leave it always for the audience. Mohamed, first, thank you for that very, very thoughtful presentation, and also personal presentation, revisiting both some of your trauma, but how you have connected it to much bigger issues around our responsibilities to think about the state of democracy. You have before you very much an audience with faculty, graduate students, as well as members of the public. And I'm wondering, you've talked about the role of journalism. We've been thinking a lot this week also about the role of the university. And so if you just might want to comment on either the skill sets, what is it that you would like to be taught in our classrooms about both examining news and our role as citizens, but also more broadly the public role that academics and intellectuals can play in both, you know, monitoring and commenting publicly on situations of terrorism broadly, or speaking up for press freedom. So just the roles of academics would be helpful. Thank you. Thank
you. It's a very, very important question. You know, the protests in the Arab Spring were sparked by mainly students and the youth. I have probably been to uncountable protests and political events that happened in Egypt and other countries that started from inside universities in these countries. So the role of education is probably the most pivotal role when it comes to the sea of change that was happening in the Middle East, for example. To implement democracy accurately, if I could even use that term these days, is to implement a better educational system. Because what I realized at the polls is that many, whether it was in Egypt or in Libya or in Iraq, many of those who were going to vote had no clue what they were voting for. You know, they were either being manipulated by false information, or in many cases, sometimes by the Muslim Brotherhood, they were giving them, and I've seen this myself, boxes of food and oil, cooking oil, and baby milk, so they can influence the vote, for example. So I do believe that the role of universities is extremely important. The role of the educator is a game changer. And I also think that we here in Canada should try to, you know, bring in more, rather than rely only on the theoretical part of it, bring in more educators or speakers or lecturers on a freelance basis who have been on the field to speak to the students in general. Even students, journalism students specifically, who want to jump right back into on the field, which is understandable. When you're young, you want your name to be out there, you want to cover the biggest story, but I always tell the students, for example, you got to wait, you got you know, a lot of these journalists you see on TV have taken hostile environment training. A lot of these people, you know, they go in with an army that you don't see on the camera, producers, and you know, sometimes even retired military servicemen who come in specifically to protect you, tell you when to wear your flak jacket, whatnot. So students need to understand that. You know, you can be the best journalist in the world, but if you don't go back home to file your story, it doesn't mean anything.
Very interesting talk. I call myself a media education consultant, half writer, half academic. I was interested in your reference to social media and the promise, in your view, it offers, beginning with the Arab Spring and as an instrument of protest and so on. What kind of concerns do you have, if any, for the ways in which the social media and the internet, electronic media, has fueled the radicalization of people, not only in the madrasas and Saudi Arabia and places like that?
Sure.
Here in our own midst in Canada.
Yes, sure. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. Many of these terrorists and organizations started using social media to infiltrate society over there and to spread their sick ideologies. As a journalist in the morning, I started waking up I follow them strictly to see what they're saying, what they're doing, just the same way that the social media changed the way governance was being dealt with in the Middle East. You know, ministers started using Twitter, creating accounts, and instead of having press conferences, they would use Twitter to spread the statements. The activists as well, they would congregate and announce the places of their protests, where they're starting from. So it became a very important tool for us journalists as well. More than ever, we started embedding tweets into our reporting online. And unfortunately, it has also been, abused by these groups. So Twitter and Facebook and other social media platforms have a responsibility to flush these extremists off the internet and to be able to not allow them to use the social media as a tool against civilians and innocent people.
We have two more questions, and if time, I'll let you again. Oui, madam.
Hi, I'm an academic in socio-legal studies, and particularly in the Iraqi context. And so my question has to do, part A has to do with Al Jazeera in particular, and Arab channels in general, which are mostly either funded by Saudi Arabia or by Qatar, countries that are very anti-Shia in their, anti-minorities in their rhetoric. So you'll see Al Jazeera Arabic host an episode about committing genocide and actually pushing for the genocide of Alawis in Syria. Al Jazeera journalists, Al Jazeera Arabic, I'll clarify, because you did mention that we shouldn't treat all Al Jazeera as one, and I don't know, this is my question, how do you distinguish Arabic from English? The Arabic journalists stand on the front lines in Iraq, calling ISIS fighters martyrs, while calling murdered Iraqi children just killed people, losses, fatalities, but ISIS fighters are martyrs. And I, as an Iraqi, am incredibly, and as a Shia, incredibly offended by that. So my question is, how would you make that distinction, since you did make the statement we shouldn't treat it all as one umbrella? Part B of my question has to do with how would you address the normalization of anti-Shia rhetoric in Arabic media and in Western media. The US media, even Canadian media recently, and it disturbs me, British media has been following suit from those major Arab networks and keep on using terms like Shia militias when they're the people making the biggest sacrifices in Iraq. You say that to an average Iraqi Shia militias, they will be offended. So the West has no idea what's happening there on the battlefronts. And so how would you address this normalization of anti-Shia rhetoric in this whole, war on terror?
Thank you. Very, very important question. I am actually in contact with a professor in Vancouver who's doing a specific study on how Al Jazeera Arabic is supporting genocide against Shiites. You nailed it on that aspect of it all. You know, this is the topic of the hour. You know, as we speak, there's a huge rift in the Middle East between Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, and we're seeing, you know, probably, yeah, for the first time, the Saudi network Arabia is going all out and, you know, against the Qataris, and the UAE are going all out against the Qataris, and the Qataris are doing the same thing. So these channels are now being used basically blatantly as tools to fire out at other countries and aspects of it. Yes, it is very awkward that it is now being branded as Shiites, Sunni, but, you know, unfortunately, the reality on the ground in Yemen, in Syria, is there is some sort of a proxy war going on between Shiites and Sunnis. We cannot deny that. It's happening right there and then. What is wrong is to have a network like Al Jazeera Arabic promote this act against the Shiites and like it's a normal thing to do and get away with it. I've been speaking about it on the internet. I've been upset about it. But unfortunately, it is now a war, a miniature war of Islam versus Islam, where you're having these groups are funded by Iran, and some groups are funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are Sunni, and it has turned into that kind of battle. Is it acceptable? No, it's not acceptable. Sometimes in the West, Western channels, Western media, there's a linguistic guide with every channel, and that linguistic guide changes by time. So in Afghanistan in the 80s, CNN was calling bin Laden's supporters and fighters as the Mujahideen. Now they're being called terrorists. You know, so it is something to look out for if you are a person who is conscious and concerned about the uses of these terminologies. I fall into it sometimes myself too, but hopefully not on air. When I say, oh, this guy's a terrorist, but, you know, say, hey, wait a second. No, we don't think he's a terrorist, you know, but I totally understand what you're saying, and I think it is a topic that needs further attention, and, you know, it is unacceptable now. There are Shiite stations, there are Sunni stations. It brings on an energy of intolerance and insightful hate speech, and I'm with you that it's definitely a concern.
Hi, my name is Selena, and I'm a sociologist who studies social justice. And I just wanted to start by saying it was very powerful to hear you say that advocacy was part of what kept you going while being detained, because I remember signing petitions, and I think sometimes, you know, when you're organizing, you're not quite sure, you know, there's like a fatigue that kind of sets in with petitions, so it's very powerful to kind of hear that back. And I was curious to know, I mean, you spoke very eloquently about journalism and democracy. I was curious to know how you see the relationship between journalism and activism. There's been controversy lately, you know, around Desmond Cole, you know, who was told that he was too activist to be an effective journalist in terms of his work with Black Lives Matter. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your perspective on the connection.
Thank you so much for signing that petition. I got to tell you, my wife used to smuggle these petitions and articles during the prison visits, and there was a lot of this, and, you know, hiding and hugging, and she'd put it here, and she'd hide it in the food, under the fish and the rice, and it was more important than the food, because I go back to my cell, and I want to see what people are saying outside, you know, and I used to get goosebumps reading these notes on the internet. I used to say, you know, wow, you know, I have something to look forward to. So it's extremely important, the advocacy. And there are so many groups, CGFE, have a small foundation that I started called Fahmy Foundation. There's so many people you can support in Ethiopia, in Egypt, prisoners, you know, Saudi Arabia, like Raif Badawi and others. So many people who need that kind of support. And their families as well, who have no clue. You know, you never know what's going to happen. My wife overnight, she was very shy in photographs. Suddenly she was on CNN, she was talking to the UN, she was going to meet Egyptian politicians, Canadian politicians, and she had to really remove that stigma. She had to humanize me because people just see the word terrorist or spy and you know, we understand that we all have our lives and we don't read much into it, but that is very important to any person who is detained. This thin line between journalism and advocacy and respecting it as a journalist is our shield from prosecution. You know, objectivity, you know, sometimes I would stand and I'd see a live shot, okay? And I would see 3 journalists. 2 are reporting that the police has killed the protesters, and the 3rd is reporting that the Islamists have killed the protesters. You know, subjectivity versus objectivity, this is very important when we're talking about journalism. But yes, I mean, to be an activist, and in many ways, there has been a huge aspect of the problem Al Jazeera fell into. And I'll explain this very briefly. Al Jazeera, when the Arab Spring started, as you all know, their conflict zones have become very hard to cover. So Al Jazeera, what they did is that they started relying in a very fluid manner on citizens. But that didn't fall, that was not acceptable in many ways by many security apparatuses in Libya, Syria, Egypt, Yemen, Iraq. Why? Because citizen journalism is when you are walking and you as a journalist, you spot that explosion, you send it to the channel. What Al Jazeera started doing is that they started commissioning citizens who have no journalistic experience, who obviously have a bias in the Syrian or Libyan conflict, so it became part of the conflict rather than just a messenger reporting on the conflict. And that is the problem that got so many Al Jazeera journalists imprisoned because of decisions that the managers took. So, you know, I will say this, and I expand on it in my book, and I don't give it enough context by saying it here, but in prison, I met so many students, and some of them were bundled in our case, who were Muslim Brotherhood students who believed in their cause, and that's their business if they don't like the military. But they also told me that they were working for Al Jazeera. I was like, wait a second, I didn't see you in the office. You know, I was the bureau chief. Where'd you come from? You know, but they were throwing Molotov cocktails openly. They were organizing protests, but they were also filming for Al Jazeera, sending it to Al Jazeera, and getting paid for it. And they were telling me, hey, by the way, you know, we're getting, you know, half the money, we were spending it on sandwiches for the protesters and getting them flags, and the other half we were saving for our marriage. I was like, okay, great, but nobody told me this was happening. So that's one of the problems I've had with Al Jazeera, and you'll find a lot of critique based on these facts in my book as well.
I'm perfectly willing to shorten my speech to let the people who are up ask their questions. Please make short questions, and I'll let Mohamed provide short answers.
Thank you very much. My name is Radha. I am an associate editor for a publication in the city of Brampton. My question to you, you had talked about the way that to combat these ideas and terrorism is by targeting the curriculum, the main curriculum at the core. Do you think that is actually possible to do with the vastness of all these different groups that are coming up? And what do you predict that the Middle East is going to be looking like maybe in the next 10 years because of everything that's been happening now?
Yes, I do believe that there is a possibility of you know, changing the curriculums in some countries in the Middle East that includes very unacceptable you know, text. I think they're already starting to realize that, and there are many organizations that are talking about that. I also believe there is always room for change. For example, in the 80s and in the early 90s, people in the Middle East, in countries like Kuwait, and I did it myself too, in Kuwait, I would go put some money in the supermarket because it says this is for charity. Later on, we learned that a lot of this charity was going to some of these groups in Afghanistan, and we didn't know as private citizens. You know, so now these countries in the Middle East have curbed a lot of this. They have limited, and they have monitoring of these NGOs and of these charity organizations, because some of them were indeed funding these extremist groups. So there's improvements already, but there needs to be more in that sense.
There.
Okay, next.
Short questions, short answers, and note, and you guys go on with the rest of your days.
Hi there, my name is Dawood Sarfraz, and I work with the Ministry of Education. I just wanted to revisit one of the issues that you spoke about briefly as well, the issue of fake news and social media. A lot of people nowadays, we get a lot of our news from social media, but we hear a lot about the issues of articles that are misleading, misinforming, really switch the side of a story. What are some of your thoughts on that and some of your advice on that for us?
Before you answer, we'll take the last question.
Hi, my name is Sakina. I had a question you had commented on, and I would like your comment on it actually. The linguistic vocabulary that's used by media, for example.
Sorry.
How would you balance the linguistics that use, Islamist, terrorist, madrasas with, coming to the West as a Muslim? When you keep hearing these labels, they kind of brush, it's broad strokes, right? You say all Muslims, because you say, unfortunately, when you always say terrorist, it's a Muslim terrorist, right? So how would you be able to comment on the media being able to balance these different aspects out so that it's not broad strokes?
Yeah. Well, a terrorist is a terrorist. Sometimes, it is appalling that they would say, oh, he's a Christian terrorist or a Muslim terrorist, and to me, I have been criticized myself for using the word a bit too much, terrorist, by Robert Fisk, who's a well-known author who's reviewed my book, because because I lived with them in our pajamas all day, and I have a sort of very aggressive stance on what they do, and so for example, I'll tell you something that Al Jazeera did. They sent an email to the staff after I left, when I was in prison. They said, please don't call Jabhat al-Nusra in the broadcast as al-Qaeda affiliated. Why did they say that? Because Qatar does not consider Jabhat al-Nusra as terrorists, and they allow some funding to go to Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. Well, to me, that sounded like a joke, because Jabhat al-Nusra's leader, Mohamed al-Julani, was a member of al-Qaeda. He had prescribed to Mr. al-Zawahiri's ideology. So for him to brand himself in a different way, in a different group with a different name, that doesn't take away much of what he does in killing innocent people and journalists and so on. So I would call him a terrorist. He's terrorizing people and who don't prescribe to his ideas. And he's fighting the Syrian government, whether you agree with Bashar al-Assad or not. So this is just one example of how the media will control the language on TV, and in this case, to be the same what the Qatari government, who owns Al Jazeera, thinks of Jabhat al-Nusra.
I would have
liked to add more, but
yeah, and you can talk a little bit afterward.
We can talk.
I'll go very rapidly. As Arun Siddiqui mentioned, there are some preconditions to having the ability to debate things like that in our universities, and we should depart in appreciation with all the preconditions of those kinds of things that we have. The Federation wishes to thank Ryerson and Mohamed Lachemi and everybody that have been involved with organizing this series. You're welcome here tomorrow at the same hour for a debate, which will have Aja Monette and Desmond Cole talk about Black joy, resistance, revolution, and radical love. I'm about to give a gift to Mohamed on behalf of the Federation, but I should add that if he wants real maple syrup, il est bienvenu à Québec au mois d'avril en 2018. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.